Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to From Per Capita to Pro Capita, the launch of the Social Progress Imperative. I'm Michael Green. I'm the Chief Executive of the Social Progress Imperative, and I'm thrilled to be here today for you to hear a bit more about this index, what we've found, but most importantly, how we're going to move to action. The mission of the Social Progress Imperative is to improve the lives of millions of people around the world by offering concrete, actionable information to business, government, civil society, social entrepreneurs, so they can drive meaningful change around the world. The Social Progress Index is our first product. It's a product that's there to help drive change in the world. So we're really glad that you're here to hear about the index, but also to help us develop and formulate our vision for the future and really drive change. I just want to say a few words at the beginning, if I can pop a slide up, because I think what we want to do in this session was put in a bit of context, in that there's been a debate going on for centuries about how do you measure the wealth of a nation? What is a wealthy nation? What does it mean to be a prosperous nation? And I'd like to introduce you to one of my heroes back in the 17th century. It's a man called William Petty. And William Petty was born in very humble circumstances, and he went to join the British Navy. And while he was doing something he shouldn't have been doing, fighting the French, he broke his leg and was hospitalized. But he went and studied Greek and Latin and mathematics and earned a place at Oxford University. And he became a professor there at a very early age, before the age of 30. But he was quite bored with just the academic life. So he went off soldiering, and he ended up as part of the British invasion of Ireland. And he was given a job by the Oliver Cromwell, the British ruler at the time, to work out the value of Ireland. And what he was told to do was to go around and count everything. Count the cows, count the houses, count everything. And Petty did this, but he came up with a really important insight that was fundamental to economics. Because Petty realized that the wealth of a nation isn't just the physical stuff that's lying around. It's the productivity of the people. And in so doing, he revolutionized economics. He drove new thinking in economics. And he very much laid the foundations for this man, Adam Smith, a century later. And it was Adam Smith who wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, and talked about this whole way that the wealth of nations isn't about how much gold is sitting in the treasury of the king. The wealth of nations is about your productive potential being used efficiently. And Smith shaped economics has shaped economics ever since, the last 250 years. Now, I want to zip forward a bit, a century and a half from Adam Smith, to another great economist. And this is a man called Simon Kuznets. And Kuznets was born in the Soviet Union in what today is Belarus, but emigrated to the United States as a young man, excelled at university as an economist and a statistician. And in the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, he was called in by Franklin D. Roosevelt's government and given a challenge, which was, how do we figure out what's going on in the American economy? We know something's going wrong, but our data, our statistics are rubbish. And if we're going to get out of this mess, we need better information and data. And Kuznets went away and he came up with a tool. And that tool is gross domestic product, GDP, the tool that we're talking a bit about today. But Kuznets is a very important person, not because he's the villain of the piece who created GDP. He's actually a hero. Because Kuznets said very clearly, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. The man who designed GDP, when he submitted it, said, use this to manage the economy, but you must not use it to measure the welfare of society. And of course, we know what happened. It's become the dominant measure in the world. So we know there's been a problem. There's been a problem that's been hanging around for a long time. How do we get a better measure of what the welfare of society is, what well-being is really about, the true wealth of nations? And so I'm delighted that last night, Michael Porter gave us this astounding presentation about explaining the insights of the Social Progress Index model. And joining a succession of great thinkers, Michael has been leading this effort to come up with a new effort, the Social Progress Index. Michael, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Welcome.
So, Michael, thank you, and thanks all of you for joining us. And hopefully this session will be not just broadcasting, but a very much of a working session. We have some terrific panelists here to really talk about not only how we measure social progress, but also how we use those measures to actually make things better, which is something that all the people at this forum care about. But I think what we have come to believe is we need some new tools. We need some new rigor. We need some new data to inform this process. Not siloed data, but really a holistic framework for thinking about how well we're doing in a given society, in a given country. And the Social Progress Index is really the beta version of that tool. I'm very proud of what we've been able to accomplish with the team over the last few years. This is an enormous discontinuity. There's more things captured in one place about social progress here than we've ever attempted before. It'll get better. It can be improved. But I think we have something here that gives us some new ways of looking at success of economies and success of countries and success of societies. And what I'd like to do in this session to distinguish from last night's session is not so much talk about kind of the fundamental concepts underlying this. Perhaps in passing we'll do that, but show you some of the data itself. I was under strict rules last night. I couldn't give you any of the results because we had to wait until 12:01 this morning. The website is live. The results have now been published. We are getting some wonderful media coverage in various parts of the world. What I'd like to do is give you sort of my kind of broad interpretation of what some of the findings have been, and hopefully that will be of great interest to you. But again, we want to get beyond the index itself to how do we use it, and how do we move forward to actually create change. Now, the kind of core idea here is we've got to really, if we're going to drive social progress, we can no longer try to commingle economic measurement and social measurement together. All the existing efforts at this make that choice. The Human Development Index, one of the key variables in the Human Development Index is GDP per capita. In the Legatum Index, there's several of the key variables are economic variables. The same is true in all the efforts we're aware of. What this does is it says, no, we got to measure social progress directly. Pull out the economic. It's going to be interesting to see how it relates to the economic, but conceptually, if we put those two together, we lose our ability to understand what's going on. In order to measure social progress, we have to have a working definition of what we mean by social progress, which I gave you last night, which is, of course, an inherently broad concept and can be a subjective concept. But we have to have a working definition of what we mean by it that we continue to refine and improve. And this is the definition that I think we found at least helpful and rather broad in encompassing almost everything that we found in the literature that people are writing and caring about under this general line of work. Now then we translate that definition, that broad definition, into a framework, a measurement framework, built around three fundamental dimensions that you see here of social progress, which we think are qualitatively at least different. There's a sense almost of a sequence here, but really not. But what we'll see is that there really isn't a sequence. It's not that countries do these things sequentially. They do them in very interesting patterns as they develop. For each of the dimensions, then we try to articulate what we call the components that are kind of the sub-ideas under each of the dimensions. And you see those. And then the next stage, of course, is to develop the actual indicators of social outcomes of that concept. And you see here, which is a busy slide, of course, the 52 indicators that roll up into the components, into the dimensions, into the overall index. But of course, we capture all the richness of this data for every country. We know how every country compares on every one of these variables. So although we roll up to a single index, we can then explode that out and look at the strengths and weaknesses, the interesting areas where there seems to be strength, the interesting areas where there seems to be issues, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. The weighting system is a little bit complicated and a little bit statistical, so I don't want to show you, talk too much about that in the limited time here. But ultimately, when we get to the three major dimensions, we are weighting equally. We have no basis now on which we would weight in any different way, but equally. Perhaps over time, as this effort iterates, as we learn more, we will decide that there is a rigorous weighting system. But right now, we're weighting these outcomes rigorously. And let me emphasize that we're measuring outcomes. We're not measuring how much you spend, how much you care, what your policies are. We're measuring the actual outcomes as best as we can measure them in all of these dimensions. Now, here is the ranking in the initial set of 50 countries. Last night, as I said, we tried to capture most of the important countries. I don't want anybody here to think that their country isn't important. What I meant there was large countries, so I should have said that more precisely. Our goal is to measure every country as soon as we can get appropriate data to allow us to do that in a meaningful way. And one of the things we're going to be doing is building out the data over time. So this ranking, I think, is, there's nothing kind of shocking about Sweden being on top. There's quite an energy in the UK today about UK being number 2. So we're happy we pleased at least one government. There's nothing terribly shocking about Ethiopia and Nigeria and Uganda being on the bottom. So at one level, this seems sort of sensible. But what's really interesting here is not the 1 through 50. That is interesting. It's really thinking about, first of all, the components of why a given country is where it is, and then ultimately starting to compare the rankings and the dimensions of rankings on this index versus more traditional economic success. So let's talk about that. Now, if we take Costa Rica, let me just point out, Costa Rica on this index is 12th of the 50 countries, but it's 23rd on income. Okay, here's a country that's generating much more social progress than you would expect if you thought it was driven totally by income. There's a difference between social progress and GDP per capita. If you look at the big three dimensions, Costa Rica's good on basic human needs, but that's not where they're the most unique. Where they're most unique for a country of their income is being able to generate the higher rankings on those other two dimensions. So think of now our insight about Costa Rica. It's grown. We all know that Costa Rica was kind of good and had a strong social, kind of social orientation, but now we can start to see, gee, what's really that all about? Where's that happening? And I'll show you some more data on Costa Rica in a minute. Now, here then this is kind of a fascinating slide for me, who've never seen anything like this before. Now what we've done is we've taken the index on the vertical axis and plotted it against GDP per capita. And that blue line is the best fitted regression line. And what we see is the relationship between social progress as we're measuring it and GDP per capita is a nonlinear relationship. It's a relationship where you have very, very high improvements in social progress associated with the earlier stage of income growth, that steep side on the left. But then, as you see, when you get to high income, it kind of goes flat. It kind of goes flat. One of the reasons it goes flat is the odd data point of United Arab Emirates. which we need to talk about a little bit. Here's a country with very high income that's way below the expectation in terms of social progress. But we also see that even if we didn't have the United Arab Emirates, we see a kind of a flattening out. Part of the reason is that high-income countries are actually generating environmental unsustainability. So all of a sudden, when you start measuring the social progress, the environmental sustainability stuff starts going down with high-income countries. So this is the kind of, and other things are happening as well that again, I can't cover in this short amount of time. Look at then some of the key relationships between countries. Look at the difference, for example, between Costa Rica and South Africa. They have roughly the same level of income, or roughly $12,000 PPP adjusted purchasing GDP per capita. But look at the tremendous difference in the social progress. Wow, there's something interesting and important to learn about that. Now that we have a distinct measure, but now we can tear that apart and we can start seeing, well, what's going on there? What's going on? Where's that coming from? And here's some more data about Costa Rica that's quite hard to see, but what you start to see then is what are the components of Costa Rica's success in delivering social progress as we roll it up, and then what are the areas where even though Costa Rica is such a marvelous socially aware, social investment kind of an economy, look at the areas where Costa Rica has some serious problems. So what we find is all countries at whatever level have real issues to deal with. And this starts to highlight and isolate those issues in a way that we haven't been able to do before. We can look at competitiveness, and we have lots of ways of understanding why a country is competitive or not competitive. But in terms of some overarching measure of social progress, we've really never been able to do this, and that's the promise of this approach, and that's the promise of this framework. We see on the lower income, we see a tremendous difference between Ghana and Nigeria. Again, relatively similar levels of income. Again, we can tear that apart and start to see what's going on, what's Nigeria put in place versus what Ghana has put in place, and how can we explain those differences. And of course, we can do that all across the spectrum and see where every country stands. And again, I urge you and encourage you to look at the report. Now, this is an interesting chart it's kind of a painting. What we've got here is all the countries in order of ranking on the left. And then across the top, the first column is GDP per capita. The green means good. The red means bad or low ranked. And then the shades in between. But what you find is on GDP per capita, there's generally a relationship. You can see the greens are on the top and the reds are on the bottom. But you can see there's all these anomalies in between. And as we look at other indicators, you can see the tremendous variety of circumstances that we see in individual countries as we're able to sort of peel apart this data and look at how it develops. And if you look at the environmental sustainability column, which is on towards the right, what you find is the high-income countries are worse. So, and we see those same issues in areas like housing, for example. When a country gets wealthy, it often starts having problems with affordable housing for the whole population. There's areas in which development creates problems. There's areas in which development and income growth creates opportunities. But we see individual countries coping very differently with those problems and opportunities. And now we have an opportunity to see who's doing this well, who's doing this poorly, how do we learn from that? Again, we've never had this comprehensive ability to look at this before. I encourage all of you to go onto the website. We have enormous amounts of data there. Wonderful tools for comparing head-to-head individual countries. You pick the two countries. You can see the lineup of who's doing what. Pick your peer group. Look across countries at given topic areas. And we encourage you all to do that. It's all now available and live. And we love your comments about how to make this data even more useful. But then, of course, the real purpose of all of this is not to draw charts. The purpose of this is to create change on the ground. There's a whole lot of constituencies and stakeholders that we believe can benefit from this kind of measurement in actually driving that change process. And you'll recognize yourself in one or two or many places on this chart. In order to do that, our aspiration is to create a network that's very much, that's both global and local, but with a heavy local component. Because it's really on-the-ground interpretation of the findings for an individual country and what the implications are for that country that we think is probably the most useful process for driving change. So we're in the process of creating such a network. We've already started. These are some of the roles that we see of these local networks that we hope to create around the world in individual countries. And these, I think, will not surprise any of you. What might be interesting for you is just to see the really first and best formed network that really is already up and running. And that's in the country of Paraguay, a very interesting country where there's a bunch of people that are deeply committed to driving more rapid social progress. We've actually have an official government agreement to actually adopt this index as a way of measuring social progress in the country. And a network is already formed, and it's off and running. So I offer Paraguay as an example that it's not a theory. If we can be successful, if we can put these kind of institutions and organizations together with a government that sees this as a tool to really help drive progress, change will happen. And hopefully next year we won't just tell you about the Paraguay network, we'll tell you about what it got done. And we'll learn about how to do that better. So with that, let me stop my part of the presentation and invite the panel and Michael to kind of carry on this discussion really about why this information is important, how we can use it better, and then with your input, your advice on how to make this work more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I mean, I've worked in international development for 20 years, and there's been this almost endless conversation about we need pro-poor growth. And no one I know has ever understood what pro-poor growth is. The conversation has gone round and round in circles. And I think the power of this tool to really unpack that and give that clarity of focus and analysis that actually will generate rigorous results is what's so powerful. Let me welcome the panel. Mike gave us a slide showing the different kind of stakeholders, audiences for this product. And I think what's great is that we've got representatives of all of them here. Judith Rodin from the Rockefeller Foundation, Heather Hancock from DELOITTE, Nairi Woods from the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, and Madhav Chavan from Pratham, a social entrepreneur from India working in the education sector, which I think is a really fascinating story that we can drill into a bit. So, we've got an agreement with the government of Paraguay, which is great, and they're going to bring that into their national development framework. Maybe, Nairi, I can start with you. Governments. How is this relevant to governments? How is the Social Progress Index relevant to the challenges governments and political leaders face today?
I think it is a really important, useful tool for governments. I mean, if you think about some of the reasons why governments find it very difficult to deliver or simply don't deliver, too often democratic government is about aspiration, not delivery. Think about the cartoon of the G8 leaders sitting around and one of them says, let's commit to reducing poverty. And one of the finance ministers says, hold on, does that mean you're actually going to put money or time into it? And one of the other G8 leaders says, oh no, not that, just a commitment. And so the leader says, well then let's commit to eradicating global poverty. And so it's the lack of a bottom line. In the private sector, you've got a bottom line. If you commit to selling 3 million handsets, people can hold you to account at the end of the year. So the first thing is that it is actually giving an index about outcomes which citizens and governments can use to hold themselves to account. I mean, a second problem in government is about timing. often elected governments are only there for 4 years. So if you've got a really knotty problem, the obvious thing to do is to appoint a task force to look into it. And it will, of course, report back 4 years later, handily 1 month after the election. And so there isn't an accountability built into that system. And we know from research that very seldom do voters actually use their votes as a judgment of government effectiveness in delivering outcomes. So the electoral cycle is ill-informed and ill-designed to be to take the place of that bottom line. And then finally, government is so often in silos, both at national level and at international level. So a Department of Health is looking just to deliver on a few indicators, but certainly is not concerning itself about how much water is being used or how much education is required to deliver on those health indicators. So if you think about this index, what it's doing is it is giving us a measure of government outcomes. It's giving it, I would very much hope, in an annual way, so that regardless of changes of government, you've got something to hold governments to account against. And it's also giving us the whole picture. So it's not permitting governments so much to fall into these silos, but rather aggregating it into some goals. So I think it's a great mechanism to help overcome some of those problems of government.
Thanks, Nari. I heard Bill Clinton speak a couple of years ago, and he said that the change he's found moving from a political role into a more philanthropic role was that when he was in government, the only question he was ever asked is, how much are you going to spend on this, rather than how are you going to achieve this? And he was saying how he relished the challenge of actually solving problems rather than just throwing money at it. And I think, Mike, that's something you spoke about, it's about outcomes, not inputs. Nari, you said that there's a business has a clearer bottom line. Heather, from the business perspective, there's a clear bottom line for business. How do a new set of measures like this fit with the mission of business?
Well, I think there's a real connection between what you both said there. So if you roll back a little bit, business is there to pursue a societal purpose. It meets basic human needs as well as broader human desires. And many of the things that were up on that chart, the pillars that we've built for this index, those are things that business is addressing day in, day out as its core business. Now, in recent years, I think that's been quite a muted conversation in business. Business has forgotten to talk about its role in stewarding and shaping society, and it's perhaps, particularly since the financial crisis, been so hurt by the trust that's been damaged in business that's also given a little bit of anxiety about how it re-engages in this conversation. But I don't have any doubt that business wants to engage in this conversation, because this is core to what business is about, and it wants to solve problems and it wants to be part of this opportunity. And I think some of the movements we're seeing in the more collaborative nature of the world these days, the actors in the world, is also opening business's eyes to how it can participate. But business wants to put its skin in the game that matters. It doesn't want to do this, the old style sort of CR kind of corporate philanthropy programs, those are drifting away sort of rapidly now. Business wants to be committed in its core to the things that matter. And so an index like this, which is evidence-based, it may not yet be perfect, but it gives you evidence. It helps you be part of a conversation about where the priorities sit. And I think business wants to be part of understanding and shaping those priorities, not just then having the priorities kind of passed over the fence and say, can you please solve that now? It wants to be much more collaborative in defining the issues, in understanding them and seeing the evidence, in addressing the problem, and then it wants to be part of practical action. So I think the other real attraction in this index for business is the commitment to the social progress imperative to do something. Not just to talk about it, but to do something. And that's where business is going to be particularly engaged. It wants to invest in the things that matter.
It reminds me, there was when we were building the index, we had some consultation events, and Larry Brilliant, who runs the Skoll Urgent Global Threats Fund, said if you get this right, the ratings agencies who rate the bond market will want to use this, because it'll tell you something really useful about what countries are like and where they're good investments. And I think it's almost paradoxical that being able to separate out the economic and the social helps actually to see the two, how they relate to each other, and improve the dialogue and communication. Madhav, I mean, you're in the trenches. You're the person who is driving change on educational outcomes in India. And I know that you're doing work that's delivering education, but also pushing government. How is a tool like this going to help you with your work at Pratham to really try and get a step change in educational performance in India?
Well, I think as I saw the presentation and I heard Michael talk about it, It occurred to me that this is really about two parts. One is that it's about outcomes of what the government is trying to do, the amount of money spent, effort put in, whatever. You say something about it and say, what outcomes did you get? And the other part is social, which is not really about the government. So it's not that the government can actually launch a social movement to change attitudes about women, for example. There is a social aspect to it, that the population itself has to do certain things. It's not the government that can do it. So I think this is, if you look at it only as something that the governments will see, then we are limiting the power of what is. I think it can actually also go out as a signal to the population saying that, you may be doing so much better, but if you pull out, for example, instead of looking at the total consolidated index, if you were to pull out political freedom versus, say, general well-being in terms of health, you will be coming up with surprising things out there. So I think there should be, I would like to see these things, the ability for a user to disaggregate it and say, where am I on political freedom? Things like that. So I think what this is going to help, because when you say driving change, I don't really see myself in a driver's seat, but I keep pushing. It is about outcomes. And what we've been insisting in the education sector is you're spending so much money, but the outcomes are not there. And how do you measure the outcomes? And the battle lines are over there. How do you measure the outcomes? There is the habit of just inputs and spending is so strong that, for example, in India, the government says as a part of efforts for improving quality, so many teachers employed or deployed. And we say, but that's a necessity. It's not about the outcome. So they said employment of a teacher is seen as an outcome as well. So there's going to be a controversy over that. Who decides what is the outcome? Is there a measure of outcomes out there? So, for example, years of education is an outcome. But that is being challenged. Now in the next Millennium Development Goals, you will see that that's not going to be the goal. The goal is going to be effective learning, that there is going to be an index measurement of learning outcomes, which is not there until now. So I think in your measurement also, I don't want to challenge the whole thing. You got it started. But how do you see what is the right outcome to measure is going to be, I think this is going to lead to a lot of thinking. And in a sense, there's an opportunity, my subversive, disruptive brain starts thinking, the opportunity is to actually measure the efficiency of effort. You may be spending so much money. So for example, in my state of Maharashtra in India, they'd spent over the last 2-3 years some $14 billion on irrigation, and we have a huge, humongous drought. The water tables have not gone up at all. No recharging of the water table. So what are you doing? You're spending, so what? I think that is another opportunity that this kind of an effort promotes. And that may be even better to inform the population, the citizenry, saying that your government is spending X, which should have resulted in Y, but actually it's a fraction of Y. And I'm looking forward to some of those things.
Yeah. Well, it may be great if we can get you to come back and comment on those, because I think there's been, Mike, some very interesting work around that effort to outcome story, and I think it'd be good to hear from you on that, if that's okay. Judith, I've got a couple of questions for you. I mean, one is about, where people talk about philanthropy playing the role of the risk capital in society. In a sense, governments are constrained in ways, business have got to observe the bottom line. Philanthropy's got this resource to play the risk capital. How do you see philanthropy fitting into this model is my first question. And my second one is, I just was thinking about, one of the issues that we've talked about with this index is it's measuring countries. And within countries, India is a good example, there's huge variation. And I know the Rockefeller Foundation, you've done the work around the city level and how cities are very different units. Is this a tool that can be used below the national level? Can you think, does this seem relevant below that level?
Well, let me take the second, because I think a common theme that you're hearing is the benefit of measurement and having the kinds of very clear sets of outcomes that allow you to get a line of sight on what you're measuring for. And so whether it's at the city level or even at the individual community level, it seems to me that these variables are the ones that aggregate up to the performance of the national level, and ultimately you want to get the attention of all of the relevant actors, but it really starts at the community-based level. And so much of the work on the ground really is at the community level. So for a philanthropy, we're 100 years old this year, and our mission is for the betterment of mankind. And that vague mission, which has emboldened us for 100 years, has allowed us, and many other funders, I think, to define our own more idiosyncratic sets of outcome measures. And I think when we talk about the potential for this, whether it's government or business or the philanthropic sectors and the actors who are on the ground in the front lines every day, really having a common set of outcomes to which we are aspiring and working and pushing, using our risk capital, using government resources and private sector resources, will really be quite enabling. And this is a real systems approach that this is envisioning. And we know that the catalytic transformational effects are going to come from innovating around ways to tip systems. And it feels to me that these kinds of defined outcomes really have the potential to be systems tipping. Michael talked at the end of his comments about building networks. We always talk in philanthropy about trying to build networks among our grantees and other grantees, and of course others in other sectors, but we've never been able to agree on what the specific sets of outcomes are that we're networking to produce. And if we really can pilot, and Michael's right that this is really a beta moment, to say, what are the advantages and are there any disadvantages to aggregating our thinking? We may take very different approaches. We will take very different approaches. But if we aggregate our thinking towards a common set of outcomes, are we really finally going to be able to have the catalytic transformation that we're all aspiring to?
Thanks. Mike, can I ask you to take this question about these inputs, outputs efficiency question? What's the data telling us so far?
Well, first of all, let me say that the lot of very really interesting points have come up, and I'd like to talk about all of them, but I won't. It's okay. Don't worry. I think the question of what's the right outcomes to measure is a threshold, fundamental question. We've given it our best shot, based on the availability of data, but that doesn't mean we're happy or satisfied or think these are the right measures, and in some cases, even the right outcomes. So I think we have to, this effort, if it's going to be successful, is going to have to be intensely critical and self-critical about that question and be involved in the debates around each of the fields so that we're modernizing our view of what relevant outcomes are. It was a breakthrough to measure years of schooling at one point, probably. But now it's not. Now that's sort of obsolete. There's a much more profound way of thinking about outcomes and maybe we can now have the data to do that. But I think this is a point that I think everybody has to understand. The philosophy of this effort is to be intensely concerned about that question. What are the right outcomes to measure? And not see it as a static question. Once you have good outcomes systematically measured, then you actually are in a position to ask the efficiency question. We actually have one slide, I think, in our report that looks at educational spending versus the educational outcomes that we have, and it's kind of like like a dartboard. There's sort of a random connection between spending and outcomes. And but imagine where we could actually create efficiency measures on every single one of these areas. What the right efficiency measure is going to be itself interesting analytical problem, but I'm confident we can do that over time. I would want to emphasize that just like in economic development, the nation is not the only relevant unit of analysis, and we need to learn how to cascade down at least to states and metropolitan areas over time, but of course that makes greater demands on the data. So we'll get there, but I think this effort gets us going down this path, and my only concern is, do we have the will, the resources, the patience, the time horizon to kind of get this right? But I think these points that have been raised are truly excellent points.
Michael, you talked about efficiency in education, as we've been doing work in health on trying to transform health systems, we have found it convenient to say it's not about more money for health, it's more health for the money. And I think in a lot of these, that's what we're talking about. What your data showed when you looked at common GDPs is that some are achieved with the same GDP, some are achieving very different things. And so if we can think about that logic in all of these elements of social progress, I think that will really move us forward in an accelerated way.
And I think the other component, as you talk about this being subnational, is also to understand how it impacts at the business level, because we are seeing business now, not necessarily on a wholehearted basis, but many businesses starting to want to report their impact, move away from traditional reporting, and whether they're talking about integrated reporting, or I know my own business now produce an impact report, not an annual report. So again, you're starting, if this can create a framework within which individual actors can account for themselves and understand their own contribution, then I think, but whether it's at the community level, the other sort of network level, the individual business, the collaborative level, all these things start to feed together, and we will just see more and more momentum build.
Well, this ties in with a nice question we got through on Twitter, which was, will business replace government organisations, philanthropic organisations? If we're seeing business and other actors taking a lead in these areas, Nairi, where does government fit in all this?
Well, I think if you went back to the slide which shows you the range of social progress that this is trying to measure, what's striking is that in every one of those baskets, there is at least a minimum role that government has to play. It might be a regulatory role, and there's no other actor within any society that actually has the legitimate authority to make a universally enforceable rule, for example. So you're not going to get around government in any way in the exercise. I guess one of the questions I would put to both Michaels is, a question that arose in a discussion of this morning was, once a government sees, or once a country or voters or social entrepreneurs see where their country is on this grid, what can this exercise tell them about how to do better? What's the toolkit for doing better? And I guess my question about that is about, well, firstly, it's about whether you are expecting universalizable toolkits and lessons to come out of that. And perhaps you are, perhaps you're not, but also how do you resist the temptation, which is so overwhelming in organizations and governments and among social entrepreneurs, to so-called scale up? In other words, slightly preemptively to take a lesson and immediately to try to pump it out as a universalizable lesson, when in fact, I think some of these social progress indicators will be driven by forces which are quite particular to each country, and which actually you want different communities to own and feel proud of. This is their way of achieving this particular goal, and which you could do damage to by imposing a different way to achieve it.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Imposed agendas are very dangerous. I mean, but Madhav, you are pushing, not driving, but you're the person who's got the experience pushing. Help us on this question. And yes, I am deflecting it.
I think the governments react quite differently. You get a good outcome, a pat on the back, and my number is high, and you go and tom-tom everywhere. But it doesn't mean that if you're low down. I saw, looking at India, 43 number. I don't want to be there. But that the Indian government is going to say, so what? I mean, because if you look at the broad picture, it's going to say, and this is typically how a bureaucrat, somebody who wants to not listen to you, is going to say, look, the richer countries all have a better index and the poorer countries have a poorer index, and we are a big country, don't compare us with, Ghana or Ethiopia or whatever. So there are excuses all the time. The question about businesses coming in and other communities coming in, or not going to the national level but going to the sub-national, it should be possible to encourage people to say you can improve your own surroundings and don't necessarily depend on governments. Because in many parts of the world, government is not the way it seems in the developed world. Governance is a major issue around the world, outside the developed world. So we do have democracies we elect, and some people call it electrocracy rather than democracy. that somehow you swindle people into voting yourself into the power and then do pretty much what you want. It's like the zebra crossing, you know. In the developed world, you walk on the zebra crossing, cars stop on both sides, and you expect that to happen. In India, if you try to do that, you expect to be run over. The symbol doesn't have the same meaning. So I think this, whether the governments will do that or not, I really cannot say. Governments are there to lord over the population. We're still, it's a democracy, all right, but democracy coming out of a very feudal kind of feeling. There used to be a lord, and now I am your lord and master. I use this in Indian languages. See, in India, the government is not a separate word. We use the word sarkar. I don't know how many Indian friends are here. That was a term used to address the lord, the feudal lord. And that continues as the word for government. So people may not see it as different. I don't know whether I said anything sensible.
No, you come in, then I want to ask Mike to talk about this driving change.
I do want to throw in a word of warning about treating all of government as though it's not people that make government function. Not every member of the Indian government is.
No, I agree with that.
Is, as it were, a lord immune to the mission, to a mission. However, what I think is important, and it echoes in what you're saying, is that some of the most well-intentioned politicians with integrity who have been elected and who see themselves as servants of their people and want to achieve something, too quickly find they can't. There are 15 committees, 4 task forces, 2 elections, etc., all in their way to doing what they know they ought to do. And so I think the more important thing is not therefore to discard government and say we always need to subvert it, but to think about how we make it more possible for those who want to effect change through government and to govern well to do so.
But that's where the question of what needs to be done and giving other measures, like you're spending but it's not leading to progress. Now pointing those kinds of things are going to be important. So index is a good beginning, but we need to have lots of pieces within the index that will help the government also, the good guys in the government, to actually say this is what we need to do.
Now, Mike, you've done a lot of this work, advising governments around the economic competitiveness side. So you've got experience on that. How does this apply to social progress? How do we deal with some of these challenges?
Well, I think we've sort of brought up, I think, the key issues. I think at one level we have to define what outcomes we care about and get better and better and better at that over time. And ideally not just educate leaders in government or other institutions about those outcomes, but also at some level the public. So the public can start to think broadly about, what should we care about here? But then kind of the next level is the efficiency. How much are we spending? How much activity is there in this area, and what are we getting for it? I mean, that's kind of a simple calculation. That's relatively simple calculation. But then there's the toolkits. There's what do you do to move the needle? And I totally agree with Judy and others who said that is contextual to some extent. There are best practices about policy and interventions that we can share across societies, but there's also enormous amounts of unique circumstances. And so I think what we see coming out of this is going to be sort of not formulas, but bodies of case studies which really inform, how do you approach the question of creating change in your particular context, given the best practices we see elsewhere. Now we can very easily identify what are the 10 countries that seem to be doing the best job on this particular outcome. Let's look at them and maybe compare them to the 10 countries that are doing the worst job. But we now have, I think, a platform for that work, but that work will roll out over time, and hopefully we can engage a lot of others in that work.
I also think there's been an evolution in a lot of civil society, NGO actors who may have originally felt that going around government was the most effective way to get things done, particularly in these areas. And now I think what we're seeing is that they are directly going after government and trying to move government. And when that doesn't work, they're going to remove government. And so we've got to work that way. We can't sideline or marginalize them because there is power. and there are new ways of acting to engage them in this dialogue. I love that Paraguay has the government as a partner, and the government's made that commitment. I think it will accelerate social progress more quickly.
Can I just we talked about sort of the governmental system and the democracy of government. I wonder about the democracy of the market. Heather, in terms of, we've heard a lot about businesses wants to change. We've heard different ways about big global brands want to change. You're a global business. I mean, how much of an audience do you think there really is for businesses wanting to do things differently, think in these terms? Is the appetite there? And also what we hear from a lot of executives is, I'd love to do it, but shareholders won't tolerate it. I mean, how to accelerate this change in the business world?
And we've touched already on that sort of investor community and how perhaps they might, not just at the national level in terms of how an agency might see a country's rating progress, but I think the way the investor community understands the societal expectations of business and reflects that further into the way it makes its own judgments about the length of stakeholder engagement it's going to make in a company and the way in which it's going to influence that company. I think that's still a fairly nascent movement, and hopefully this will help that movement get some more momentum behind it and some more sort of rigidity and definition behind it. So I wouldn't pretend that we're all the way there with that. More broadly, I think we hear increasingly business leaders, large and small, and it would be a mistake to think this is only something in global corporations, because frankly I would say the SME sector, those people who are very connected to their local community, they might not recognize this language because they just think this is what they're doing, this is what they're part of. So they're already there, thinking in this way, operating this way in a very local way. But I do think sort of bigger business leaders, the more thoughtful people, the people who understand that they've got to rebalance the nature of their engagement with their markets, with their own employee base, with their customer base, with their supply chain. This is something they're grappling with and looking, this is a solution that they can engage with. So I think in several ways, there's an opening and an opportunity for us to accelerate that conversation with business. It would be naive to say that it's all going to be sort of sunlit uplands overnight. Of course it's not going to be sunlit uplands overnight. But nevertheless, I think there's an appetite for business, large and small, to say, we want to be in this game. I think business doesn't want government out of the picture. I really genuinely don't think that. I think any thinking person knows that some of the issues we saw up on that screen, they're big, chunky, intractable problems. There's a reason they mostly fall to government to deal with them. If they were easy to deal with, then presumably somebody would have set up some business model to deal with them by now. So it's being part of the solution, not thinking it can be the replacement for the solution.
Well, it'd be good to get your perspective on this role of business question, because you've written extensively around shared value. And also, there's another question that's come through on Twitter, is about how does the Social Progress Index fit with other things that are out there, whether it's Millennium Development Goals, or how does it fit with things like new impact investing frameworks? How does this dovetail into that wider framework?
Well, I mean, in a way, it connects to many, many other things. Millennium Development Goals cover a subset of the kind of things we're trying to measure the social outcomes of, and maybe over time we'll have more and broader Millennium Goals as we get more comfortable measuring and setting objectives in more areas. So I think the Millennium Development Goals is an effort in a few areas to really see if we can motivate and inspire countries to improve outcomes, and I think at one level it's been very, very successful in drawing attention to that, but I think that is a mechanism for accelerating change on some areas. Hopefully we can spread that to more areas. In terms of impact investing, I mean, impact investing is about seeing investment as a way of moving the needle on an important societal problem, and again, here we have the menu of societal problems to try to impact, and a comprehensive framework for identifying which of those problems are most acute both in the world but also in particular countries and regions. So I think I see this effort as really critical infrastructure, measurement data infrastructure that both is the front end of change processes but also is the way of bringing together a lot of what historically have largely been more discrete activities at the grassroots level. I mean, there's a lot of other indexes out there. I covered that yesterday, but I think what we believe that this is really quite unique in focusing solely on social outcomes, focusing solely on outcomes, not just inputs, trying to be holistic in defining social outcomes as broadly as possible. And it's very much, as somebody sort of questioned earlier, it's intended to be an annual process. I hesitate to use this word, forever. So that with the understanding that what exactly we're measuring is going to, evolve incrementally, evolutionary way over time.
Can I ask you, Michael? So some people will wonder, why is this different to the United Nations Human Development Index, which you mentioned last night? In what way is it different?
Well, believe it or not, the HDI has really, very small number of variables. I can't remember, I think it's either 4 or 5. We have 52. One of those variables is GDP per capita, which actually dominates the ranking. So basically, the HDI is just slightly different than GDP per capita ranking. So yes, was it a breakthrough at the time? Yes. It has an education measure, which is much more of a basic education measure, and a health measure, which is much more a basic health measure. It's heavily, to the extent that it goes beyond economics, it's very heavily on the basic needs side of the spectrum. But what we're able to do with this index is take that philosophy, which is good. Let's go beyond economics, but take it so much further. And that would be, I think, a valid comparison to make with all other efforts like this. So it's not that people haven't had the right idea. There's been this kind of persistent understanding, going back to Simon Kuznets, that there's more to measure here about success than just the GDP part. But in terms of implementing that on a large scale across a large sample of countries, we just haven't gotten it done yet. And so this isn't perfect, but this is an attempt to kind of make a big leap in that regard.
I mean, I too have heard there are many other indices, why and what and the like, and I think it's more, as I've listened to you over the past 2 days and before as you've thought about this, is as much as building this particular index as it is about building a social network within each country committed to a uniform set of outcomes that they will, from whatever sector they represent, leverage their capacity, their resources, their ingenuity to mobilize. And it's really, and that's why as we move forward with this, let's view this as the tool, but not the main event. The main event is what a tool like this, with such differentiated measurement, if it really is effective, will be able to produce.
Yep.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions related. One is this an absolute calculation or is this all relative? Because, if you draw some numbers and put them all together, cook them, and then a number comes out and that's your, because if you put it, how does the rank come? Is it some kind of relative ranking? That's one part. The reason I'm saying that is I seriously think when you say a tool, it's really right now Michael Porter's tool. I don't know how you do it. You are finally going to come up with a number and you're going to say this is the number. I would really like to encourage popularization of this kind of a measurement, which may not be as rigorous as you are. And a small town or a city could say, kids could go around and say, let me measure my social development index. And if information is available, they could just put it all together and say, this is, if it is absolute. If it's relative, they are sunk, because then they've got to get 10 other cities and say who's better. But I think that is something, unless you give the tool in the, and this is one of the learnings from our work, that if the government comes out and says this is the progress that we've achieved, it doesn't appeal a lot, unless it's to an individual maybe. But when people measure themselves and say, so how many children can read in this community? And then it's a shocker that, all these kids are going to school for 5 years and they can't read. Now that revelation has to come out, because my kid can't read is probably one thing. Very often people don't even know that. So I think how could you take this while you keep to your rigorous measurement and whatever calculation on one side, but a popular tool for the kids, for the ordinary people, which you say, go measure it yourself. Find out, because that is going to lead to that kind of an upsurge against the establishment saying you guys are not doing it. And then maybe pushing the government and changing the government. One way is to create the index and talk to people in New York. The other is to build the pressure as people find out that this is what is wrong.
Let me
just quickly, it is an absolute index. So, for example, the stillbirth rate is a percentage. It's what percentage of kids are born, not alive, and now. And a score gets created. And I think the score of the best country is somewhere in the 60s, and I think the theoretical maximum is more like 100. So no country is at perfection, if you will. And so that said, there's some complicated issues for how you roll up things, and there's some factor analysis and funky things like that involved. But I think your point is very well taken. The more we can make this a very transparent thing, that here's how you do this, I think the more powerful it'll be.
Thanks. Judith, you made this very powerful point that the main act is the network and the driving the change. And we're lucky today, we've got Raul Gauto, who's here in the front row. We get a microphone, because Raul has been the person driving the partnership with Paraguay. And I just want you to, this is where we're most advanced in building a network, building a partnership. So I'd love it if we can get a microphone down. If you could just tell us a little bit about making this happen and what we're going to be doing in Paraguay to bring that change that really is the main act.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all coming here. Well, I've been working with Fundación Avina for the last 15 years. And actually, this is what we have been doing all the time, all these years, to bring together the three sectors: the government, the private sector, and the social sector, because we believe that the only way we can make sustainable and lasting contributions and social transformation is by bringing all the sectors together. If we can help each other understand the value of the other sector, and that each one has a part of the contribution or the building blocks of our new societies, then we believe that that is going to really create sustainable development. That has been going on for several years in many countries in Latin America. So we have I would say, a large group of leaders in different organizations, think tanks, academia, business unions, and things like that. And this was just one more of the job we're doing. I basically took some information I got from SPI, and I went around to some of these leaders, the executive group from the Catholic business people, and I explained to them what SPI was after. And then I went and talked to some think tanks and universities and the government and the social cabinet especially, and they all understood that this would create a framework within which they can improve their own working. Even within Avina, that is dealing with recycling, sustainable cities, water access, and other migrations and things like that, they all understood that if they had a strategic framework measured rigorously, as you all said, then it will drive their own work towards a resultant that would make or turn or render their effort much more efficient. So I didn't really find many people against it or questioning a lot of it. So basically, it was a fairly easy job to convince people to sign up, and here we are, and we are hoping that soon Roberto Artavia and Bricio will be down in Paraguay and will start the real work of educating our people and going ahead with the index.
Super. Thank you, Raul. Raul. So what you've learned there is the Social Progress Imperative is a very rational organisation. We start with the easy bits first. But we would like to use you. You are an audience that is packed full of change makers. You have experience of bringing change in the world, and we're trying to learn. We want to get your experience on how we can use this tool, how we can get through the door to engage people, involve people. So we've got some time left, and I'm sure that we would love to have discussions about the statistical issues, or whether this indicator is better than that indicator. And we'd love to talk about that afterwards. Yeah? But we want to use this opportunity to get your experience, your wisdom, to help us understand what from your experience is the way to help us drive this network, to bring people together, to actually get change, to get government, business, civil society engaged in thinking about progress in a different way. Who's going to help us out? There's a hand right at the back on the left here. And there's one here too. Go ahead and say this one here first. We've got a microphone. There's one here.
So, hi, my name is Michael Chertok. I'm from Digital Divide Data. And I first of all, I want to congratulate you. I really think that this is an historic moment of creating this kind of measurement tool, this kind of index that is going to incent business, government, and those of us in civil society to start working towards some of these goals around the world. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity for all of us as social entrepreneurs to look at how we can work in the communities that we're working to move towards these goals. Our organization works together within the business process outsourcing industry, and this is an industry that's had a measurable impact on GDP in places like India and in the Philippines, but there's a group of us who are using a model called impact sourcing. And using this model, we're looking at what's the opportunity to create jobs for people at the base of the pyramid in Africa, for women, for people with disabilities. And we see that there's an opportunity to look at how could we work together with industry in this, how can we work together with government, and this starts to give us a set of metrics to shoot toward. Now, we can't use all 52. There are going to be a set of these within here that we can work toward, but I think that there's a way that we can work with some of the traditional industry. It's a huge industry with the NGOs who are working at this, and together with governments to make progress in this area.
Great. So this is a framework that can help working between business and social entrepreneurs. Thank you. Now, at the back.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, I have not a question, but a comment to Professor Michael Porter. Is social progress and well-being of a subject population, a given population, a subjective feeling by the persons involved, or can it be reduced to an abstract scientific standard? And assuming the people's feeling about their own well-being is at variance with this scientific standard, how do you create a conceptual bridge between those, assuming people feel they are well off and the standard shows they are not well off? How do you bridge that? Because why I ask this is it is the same problem Karl Marx faced about 150 years ago when he claimed that through his labor theory of value that workers were being exploited. And workers did not feel so exploited, and he had to propound a new theory of false consciousness that the workers actually do not know their actual situation, and they need a vanguard party to expose the social myth and religious doctrines that stopped them from seeing the reality as it was. So,
I asked you, can you help us? Give us some experience to help us.
Well, I'll give an example of the Freedom House has a standard on freedom, which they use to measure whether a country is free or a given country's people are free or not. But when you see one of the countries they have measured is Rwanda, and Professor Michael Porter is involved in Rwanda. But what you find is Gallup poll went to Rwanda and did polls. The World Value Survey did polls there, and about 80 to 86% of Rwandans were saying, we feel very free to associate, to speak our mind, to do A, B, C, D, F, G, but the standard was showing this is an autocratic state. And always my question is, therefore, how do we create a conceptual bridge when there is a variation between people's feelings?
We got the question. Thank you, sir. Now, who's going to give us some advice? Right here, please, in the orange.
Hi, my name's Chion Moore. I'm the Member of Parliament for Newcastle and Shadow Minister for Social Enterprise, which means I'm a Labour politician, for those who may not know, which means I'm very happy to take responsibility for the UK being second, as long as the data's up to 2010. And just on that, I've also, my background's in engineering, and having worked in Nigeria, which is, I think was 58th, I know that Nigeria consistently came top of polls on optimism, whilst it became bottom of polls on many other indices. But in terms of the advice that I would give, I think, I mean, it's great to see this. I really welcome this. I've been looking for something like this. But I think the advice I would give would be to let it be sort of, I think that's what you're going to do, openly used and knocked about and criticised, and perhaps you'll have versions from competing versions being suggested by other groups who may be more into business or who may be more representative of governments or in different areas of the world that may have different priorities. And ultimately, if it is a successful and effective framework, then the best model, the best version of it will come out. So a bit like Unix or Linux or whatever, let it be tested by the market of ideas.
Super, thank you. While we move the microphone to the next person here, can I just ask you might take this point about this subjective well-being issue? Because that's, I know, the one you looked at in some detail.
Well, of course, one of the ways that you could choose to measure social progress is to survey people on whether they're satisfied and happy, and that there is a, there's an index like that. There's actually a big literature on this, and and you see people very satisfied in horrible circumstances in poor countries and feeling happy, and you see people that are very unhappy in very wealthy countries that have everything. So that way of trying to capture social progress is, I think, valid, and we should be doing it. But ultimately, we believe that it isn't actionable, and that we ought to, based on our best literature, our best knowledge, our best scholarly work, our best opinion of the public, we ought to be actually trying to define the components of social progress, not the weights. The weights are going to be almost inherently subjective, but once we can identify the components of social progress in some concrete way and then measure the outcomes, then we're in a position to actually take action, hopefully. And so, although we're not opposed to the idea of measuring happiness and surveying people on their feelings of well-being, I don't think we feel that's a sufficient approach. We think we have to do this as well in order to make progress on this issue.
Thanks.
Mike, I was just going to say, I think one of the reasons you're unrolling this to this terrific forum is because there's so many ways that each of us could help and use this, and in which this index could strengthen what we do. And I sit as Dean of a School of Government with students from, with applicants from 96 different countries, people who have got experience in governments right across the world. So my instinct is, well, actually, they all have to do an 8-week summer project. They could be working on this. They could be drilling down, rather than me sitting and saying, well, there are different lessons from each country. Okay, so how do we probe those? Well, maybe here's a group of 70 well-educated people that can actually go out and individually in different countries ask the question, why in India are we not reaching this particular level in social progress? What's the barrier in this particular community? But I'm only throwing that in because I think in this audience there are other ways. We all sit in a different place, but I think there's other ways that we could be working together to make this work.
No, you don't know what you've done. I was going to ask the panel for one thought each on the country, so you've got to come up with another one now. Now, let's say this question here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. A wonderful presentation. My name is Natasha Matic, and I'm a strategy advisor with the King Khalid Foundation in Saudi Arabia. And one suggestion that was mentioned, I think Judy mentioned it, is providing governments with tools or a toolkit on how to actually move themselves up. It's one thing to say, okay, this is where you rank, but a lot of them will say, so now what do we do? What are the next steps, and how can we move forward, and what would be some areas that you can suggest would be improvements? So I think that's one way to come up with, toolkit or a guide or something for different government agencies that can help move this forward.
Great, toolkits. Can you just pass the Coming back to the gentleman in the pink shirt, to your right-hand shoulder.
Hi, my name is Cameron Elahi, and I'm with Global Catalyst Partners and Global Catalyst Foundation. I guess listening to a couple of the comments that came along, you can have this index be driven by a centrally driven professionals, totally experts who go and measure the merits. And then there is the crowdsourcing, which is the popular belief and what the citizens of each country would feel themselves. A very simple thing might be to compare the two of them, the same way as the movies. You can go and see what the critic's choice is and what they say about the movie, and then the moviegoers who go and actually rank it and rate it based on, how they like it. On Yahoo Movies, for example, you can see that. I believe it might be interesting to have it, and I would think if you have it as a crowdsource, that the citizens of each country could go and rate themselves on these 52 or 54 different criteria as a crowdsource would be a very good parallel to show this is the panel of experts and what they came up with, and this is what some of the citizens of that country rate their country. And of course there is potential for abuse, as we have seen some people go and pan a movie or promote it or whatever, all of those, but always the dust settles with a big number of crowdsource and some good data comes up that you can see from the user's point of view how good a movie is or how bad it is.
Great, thank you. If you can pass your microphone left, and I'll take the question here. I'm going to say, and Mike, maybe if you can respond to some of these thoughts when we get a few more of them in, that'd be super. Please.
My name is Dorothy Stoneman from Youth Build USA and Youth Build International. 4 quick points. One is, I think this is a spectacular breakthrough, one that we have long needed, and I thank you. Secondly, I think each of us, since you're announcing it today in some respects, at least the scoring, we should use this moment to help take it viral. I've already made a list of all the most influential people I know to whom I will email the link to the report, and I think it will be used immediately on lots of levels. Clearly, though, the group here on the stage and others of us have the capacity to convene people who you're going to want to use it, take it very seriously. I think it's a great idea to ask the question of what's being measured to local groups. Like, part of what you're asking is, all right, how are we going to use this? How are we going to mobilize to use it? But another question you're asking on the ground is, have we found the right things to measure? And I know, for instance, some of my constituency, low-income young people who've been kicked to the curb, would ask, hey, have they measured the imprisonment rates in these countries? Have they measured the violent rates? I didn't catch that, Michael, in your presentation, but I didn't see it. So if the United States level of imprisonment were included in its score, our score would go down, I think, if it wasn't included. I'm not sure. And then I think this question that the gentleman in the corner raised about the difference between the subjective and objective is fascinating, and it wasn't raised, from the panel, and therefore it's worth thinking about. What are the implications of the fact that it needs to be addressed? So those are my...
Thank you. There's a gentleman here.
Yeah, I had a quick question about, my name is Greg Husa. I'm an MBA student here. My question, Professor Porter, was about the quality of the data and transparency either on the website or, I know you only had, 15 minutes to present, but showing how the data was collected, the process, and also ensuring that the data from whichever sources were collected from, that there's a high level of quality.
Super. Thank you very much. Now, we got a microphone somewhere else.
Yeah, hi, down here.
There we go.
Hi, my name's James Hilbury from the One Number Project. We're trying to do something very similar, but for companies. Now, I don't really have an original thought of my own, but I thought I'd just echo something that Moda have said. And that's, if this is going to have maximum impact, then it needs to be understandable by the average person. It needs to get into the common vocabulary like GDP does. Now, GDP doesn't really mean much, but people know that it goes up, it's good. If it goes down, then time to kick out the government. Now, with this index, I'm not entirely sure whether if it goes up, is that actually objectively a good thing, or does that just mean that every other country got worse, or does it mean that you calculate the numbers differently this time? Now, I'm sure you've thought about this, but just want to reiterate that point that it can't be overly complicated. It needs to be for the average person.
Super, thank you. We've got someone there, and let's do this one behind, and then we go to here.
Matt Miller, Washington Post. I realize how hard this is, and I applaud the effort, et cetera. My only question was, when the stuff went by quickly, it looked like on primary education, enrollment was considered an outcome, and I was curious about that as opposed to international test scores, because it didn't seem like an outcome.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And then over here.
Hi, my name is Won-jae Lee from Korea, and I would like to share my experience, probably, if it helps. I was leading a project to evaluate corporate social responsibility of East Asian countries, China, Japan, and Korea. And that was a very political process, I would say, because we need to choose factors to evaluate this corporate social responsibility. But what is responsible is very different from country by country. So we had this fierce discussion about human rights, because we had a table of Chinese experts and Japanese experts and Korean experts, but Chinese experts never think human rights is a factor for evaluating corporate social responsibility. So this is actually my question, or maybe a suggestion, that we need sort of cross-country political process if you want to make these factors or this evaluation to be actually global and universal. So my question is, if you have thought about it, or if you haven't thought about it, I would suggest that you need probably this process.
So we've had quite a few sort of crunchy methodological questions there about some of the indicators. Mike, can you take a few of those on?
Yeah, again, this could get very, very technical, and I don't want it to do so. And we have a lot of other experts. The website has a lot of all the details of all of this. Every single indicator has been vetted for, is it done in a robust way, a rigorous way? Is it replicable? And then, of course, does it cover a meaningful number of countries so that we could measure this for our 50 or most of the 50? And the enrollment versus test score question is a perfect example. Yes, test scores would be better, but there's just not that many countries where you have test scores right now. Certainly not this range of countries. So we now are stuck on enrollment. And hopefully over time, as we stimulate the improvement of data, we'll be able to substitute that for a better outcome measure. I think enrollment is a better measure than spending, a better outcome measure than spending, because it actually is how many kids are in school. But one can imagine, again, better and better and better outcome measures over time. And what we've done is we've made a practical choice at this moment in history. But the quality of the data, I think you'll see when you see the sources of every one of the indicators, which are on the site, are mostly very reputable international organizations that we think the methodology was appropriate and best of class. So that I can assure you that we've done the best we can. Is it perfect? No. Is it the best probably that's ever been done before to do this? Yes. Can it be better? Yes, it will. And we want critique, and we want to be prodded and poked and pushed to do it better. These are absolute measures, not relative measures. And so when you see a difference on an individual indicator, it's an absolute difference. And I think that's very, very important to making this a useful tool, because this means that you can see how the absolute scores change over time as well as how the relative rankings change, and we want to see both. This year we don't have rate of change. Hopefully over time, for some indicators we have rate of change. We can tell you how much is a country moving on this indicator, up or down. Over time, we'll have rate of change on every indicator. So we'll start to be able to have this more dynamic view of what's the trajectory here Again, we can do that on some indicators, but not all. So let me stop there as to not get too technical.
Cool. And then I want to come back to our panel now for their concrete suggestions, probably going in reverse order. But before we do, I should say the team is here. Amy Wears, our research director, is here in the front row. And so if people have got sort of technical questions they want to ask, we'd be happy to answer them, because I think our policy is very much a kind of full transparency around the sources. And we really do want to, use the power of crowdsourcing, the power of, sharing this to actually improve it and shape it. And I know, Mike, you've talked a bit when we've spoken in the past about how designing these indices in the past, it takes a little while for them to bed down. There will be changes, and that comes from that process of dialogue. The other point I'd like to make is, what the index really does flag up is about how important data is. I think one thing we do very well in the index is start to think about health and wellness as not just about mortality, but actually starting to talk a bit about morbidity. And I know an issue that I just particularly interested in, mental health. We couldn't get mental health in the index because we haven't got the comparable data. And if we're thinking about global disease burden in the 21st century, mental health is going to be crucial. So the need for urgent, new data on some of these areas to help the Social Progress Index really reflect the challenges as best as possible is going to be a big advocacy cause for us, I think, going forward. Now, Judith.
So I do think that one thing that we can do and ask others to help in is exactly taking off where Michael started. And that is, what isn't here that you have evidence or knowledge is or should be very important, and can we start to advocate for measurement? Some of those things, what is in there are proxies for, and so they probably are good enough. But if it is mental health or other areas, this is the time for you to make suggestions and then to advocate for those data being collected. What I want to pick up is a meta theme that I heard both on the panel and our colleague who spoke about crowdsourcing and self-perception. There are 3 levels of knowledge. I'm a psychologist, so you'll excuse me. There's self-perception, so subjective knowledge about all of this. There's tacit knowledge, and then there's expert data. And when you talked about crowdsourcing, you were really talking about tacit knowledge. So the difference between the Michelin Guide and the Zagat ratings. And the Zagat ratings have taken over in a way, or at least they're a competitor for the Michelin Guide, because large groups of people really do know stuff that in any individual may not be known. So I would put self-perception aside here, although it's important for each of us as individuals. But the crowdsourcing of tacit knowledge and then testing that against the metrics presented by these very hard data can give us, I think, an enormous insight that we're not yet able to take advantage of. And for me, would be extremely compelling.
Just very quickly, one of the things that has made the Global Competitiveness Report richer and more effective is that it involves a large-scale survey, country by country, of a substantial number of players in the economy to try to get a sense for what's really going on the ground from the actor's point of view, as opposed to just the statistics that you can measure. And so I think some dimension of that in this effort would be very useful.
Okay, great. Madhav.
So I'm going to stick to the original point of making it a popular tool. And I would love to see Hans Rosling stand there and say how this social development index changed. I don't know whether you have any way of using old data and cooking up this again, not what you have today, but if you could do that, because he does that with the GDP and the population growth. But if you were to pick out just a few indicators, I'd love to see that change and see what's going on. I do believe that this concept that there is a social development index has to be popularized, whether the actual method and the technique can be different. But measure it yourself is something that's a very powerful tool. I believe in that.
Super. Thank you. Heather.
Same theme. I am a believer in practice what you preach, and this is an audience that definitely, I'm sure, practices what it preaches. And I think if we could each of us understand just one or two of those impacts or outcomes on the overall social progress index, that we could capture and measure and publicise and be relevant in our own organisations and all those other ones that we touch, then we're starting to get some of that socialisation and that popularisation. And we might also be quite interested in what we learn about our own organisations, the way we operate as a result of it. So each of us starting to try and adopt a bit of this way of thinking in our own organisations, I think will help give it more momentum.
Thank you. Nari.
And so this discussion makes me think about how it is that different communities can own an index of their own, so that you have a general universal index, but you also have indices which communities own, almost as though you've got your 52 indicators plus a whole lot more, whether it's incarceration or the number of machine gun wielding police officers you have to walk past every morning. I mean, different things matter for different people. And that people can just drop and click the 20 that matter most to them to see how their community rates on those 20 things. I think that would be a way of both having a national, an international comparator, but also doing what Marav is proposing to us, of really giving something that a different, whether it's a family or a community or a nation, can own and build themselves.
Right, do you have a final thought?
Gosh, I think we've heard the final thoughts. I think we're humbled by, first of all, the degree to which most of you think we're not crazy. And I'm interpreting that. Those of you that think we're crazy, please let us know. I think there's been an enormous amount of really terrific ideas, frankly. And we've been so in the weeds, trying to execute this fairly ambitious project for the last 6 to 8 months that I think it's just very refreshing to me to come up for air and listen and get all these new potential ideas opened up. I think our agenda is in some ways very clear, in other ways we have a lot of talking to do, but I just want to, my last word would be appreciation for what you've done and what everybody has contributed to this effort during this meeting.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I think I'm the ultimate beneficiary of this conversation because I've got all these great ideas that the organisation can go away and implement. So I think we shouldn't applaud Professor Porter. We shouldn't applaud the panel. We should applaud the whole room. This has been fantastic. Thank you very much.